Hello, everyone. Today I am here to talk about 10 books that heavily inspired my Gwambi Tetralogy book series. So that is my swashbuckling pirate fantasy series. Back behind me here, My Father's Land, My Father's Ghost, and My Father's God. And then coming out later this year, My Father's Will, which I'll let you know when I have a cover to share with you there. But this book series is kind of like Treasure Island meets the Chronicles of Narnia. Like I said, pirate fantasy, swashbuckling, action, adventure. And today I'm going to be telling you about 10 books that are my main inspirations behind this book series. These are going to be both nonfiction and fiction. But real quick, before I get there, if you're interested in kind of experiencing some of my writing without having to pay for it, just go to acwilson.substack.com. That's my Substack page, and I'll leave a link below here. But acwilson.substack.com, you can sign up for free, and you will get a free novel, Flashes of Fire, as an ebook. And that serves, it is a standalone novel, but it also can serve as a prequel to the Gwambi Tetralogy here. And it's a great way just to kind of experiment with my writing, see if you would like my style, see if you like the way I tell stories. And if you like it, then you can move on to the Gwambi Tetralogy. If you don't like it, you haven't paid any money, you can just unsubscribe from me, and you're good to go. See? No skin in the game. Okay, so let's go to my 10 books that inspired the Gwambi Tetralogy series. And starting off, we're going to have 5 nonfiction books, and then we're going to have 5 fiction books. But the fun thing is, this order, I don't know what order this is coming in. So I've picked these 10 books, and then they're just kind of in a random order. So I'm going to be just as surprised as you when I pick them up. So let's start off with, here we go. This book, unfortunately, has had some significant water damage here. But look at this. This is how a book is supposed to look. This is the way they're supposed to be bound. That cloth binding, it's perfect. We like this book. This is the perfect way a book should look. And this book is, of course, The Scots Worthies by John Howie. Now, this book is not necessarily a book I would recommend just anybody picking up and reading. It's pretty dense. It's not very accessible. I think it took me an entire year to read this book as a senior in high school. Each chapter is a small biography of a specific reverend or elder of the Presbyterian Church in the early, kind of like late Reformation, early period of the Presbyterians. So like during the Covenanters is the beginning of the books. So time period would be like, say, like early 1600s to the early 1700s. This book is not necessarily a great history book if you want to get into that time period, because John Howie, the author, was personal friends with a lot of the people that he's writing about in this book. And most of this book, it just revolves around like really nitty-gritty theological controversies between early Presbyterians. And the majority of this just seems really frivolous and unimportant, just like what they were killing each other over. And John Howie, because he's a personal friend with a lot of these people, is not an unbiased author. He's got a dog in the fight, and has a specific agenda he is trying to tell in this book, in the way he's depicting these biographies. So, like I say, not a book that I would just like recommend anybody pick up and read, unless you just are really interested in the ins and outs of the internecine controversies of early Presbyterians in Scotland. But the main reason I picked this book as an inspiration for the Gwambi Tetralogy is because the way John Howie writes these interdenominational conflicts really inspired the way I did the world building for the Kirk in the Gwambi Tetralogy. Just like all of these nitty-gritty theological points that probably don't matter, but everyone's getting up in arms about, and they're splitting churches over, and sometimes even killing each other over. This is just a way that I don't see people writing about religion in fantasy very often. Usually in fantasy, when you have religion portrayed, you have a specific version of that religion, and you don't have just the broad practice of the heterodoxy or the heteropraxy of these different religions, the different denominations, the different churches. So I really wanted to do that in this fantasy. So the Eldarian Kirk in the Gwambi Tetralogy is strongly inspired by this early Presbyterian flavor that you see in this book, which meant that the Rectificationists had to be inspired by the Methodists and the Diggers from the Civil War period England. Again, inspired from this book, from the way the Presbyterians and the Methodists and the Diggers all yelled at each other and argued with each other and killed each other. So yeah, that's a Scots Worthies. Again, not a book I necessarily recommend you read, but fascinating book and a strong inspiration behind the Gwambi Tetralogy. Moving on to, here we go. This is a great book. A Near Run Thing by David Howarth. This book is just a history book that looks at the Battle of Waterloo, and specifically by taking this close third-person perspective of, I believe it's 5 people who wrote about their experiences, and so we have really good details on their personal experience in the Battle of Waterloo. And so taking these 5 perspectives and from them piecing together this broad, expansive story of how the Battle of Waterloo played out. Because of the way it's written, it feels like a novel. This is a nonfiction work of history, but it feels like a novel. It feels like something that Larry McMurtry or Joe Abercrombie would write. It feels like that style of writing, and I loved it. So not only is this just an excellent history book, even if you're not particularly interested in the Napoleonic Wars, this book really shaped the way I write action sequences, and specifically black powder action sequences. The black powder warfare you're going to see a lot in the Guambi Tetralogy here. So yeah, when you're reading scenes in this book where people are shooting at each other and hacking at each other, a lot of that inspiration is coming from A Near Run Thing by David Howarth. And again, highly recommend reading this book. It's a lot of fun. The first time I read that book, I read it like in a single sitting. It's very fast to read. Moving on to another banger, The Way of a Ship. I hope you can read that okay. The Way of a Ship by Derek Lundy. This book is a history book, and it just looks at the nitty-gritty details of how to run a sailing ship or a wind ship during the height of sailing ship culture. So specifically, it takes a framing narrative of a single ship's voyage from Bristol to San Francisco across the Cape of Horn, Cape Horn, across Cape Horn. So a lot of this book is just like really nitty-gritty details on how to run a sailing ship, but Derek Lundy pulls it together with this great framing narrative of his great uncle who took this trip. And so a lot of the specific events in this book are speculative, but they are inspired by actual historical events and meticulously researched. So like this book, again, it reads like a novel. This could totally be turned into a banger Hollywood film. But it's also just really, really informative. So because I have never been in a sailing ship before, I've never actually been part of a pirate crew, unfortunately. And I've only ever seen the ocean once. So a lot of like the sailing ship fights in this book are purely based off of my imagination and my own research. And this is one of my main research tools for when I was trying to figure out the mechanics of how sails were raised and lower, how you turned spars, just all that nitty gritty detail. This is the book that gave me that information. And I highly recommend it. Again, it's just a really enjoyable book to read. Moving on to, because I was writing a book about pirates, I had to read some history books about pirates. And if you're interested at all in historical pirates, specifically Caribbean pirates, you cannot do better than The Republic of Pirates by Colin Woodard. This is basically just like the go-to history book for Caribbean pirates. We're talking Blackbeard. We're talking Charles Vane. This is the book. Now, one of the things, though, because obviously I'm addressing piracy in the Guambi Tetralogy, this book really highlights just kind of like the revolutionary and anarchist political agenda of a lot of these pirates, and that was a really fascinating side of piracy that I was unable to get to in the Guambi Tetralogy. I hope to write a future book series that has more of this kind of radical pirate political thinking, but this is not the Guambi Tetralogy, unfortunately, but you'll get a lot of that in this book, and just kind of how Colin Woodard goes so far as to claim that the Caribbean pirates political experiment was a early experiment that was then later mirrored by the United States when they revolted against England. And I don't know how historically accurate that is, if that's a perfectly accurate theory, but it was very fascinating for sure. And this book, highly, highly recommend reading. And finally, my last nonfiction book that inspired my writing. I cannot find my physical copy, so you're just going to have to make do with a picture on the screen. And that is Attached to God by Crispin Mayfield. Now, Crispin Mayfield, the author here, is a licensed therapist who uses a lot of attachment theory. And he uses attachment theory and attachment science as a way to frame a theology book here, and that is how our attachment is to God. Like, how are we attached to God? And using attachment theory science to talk about the way we interact and our relationship with God. And this book was really formative to me when I was deconstructing, and really frames the way that I am doing faith journeys in this book. Because a lot of the characters in this book, the heroes in the Guambi Tetralogy, are going through as their character journey is happening, part of that character journey is them wrestling with their faith, and the central part of that faith being their relationship with God. And so the ideas that Crispin Mayfield is playing with in this book, and what he is positing, was really impactful in how I was writing these characters' relationships with God, and how they grow in that relationship through the course of this book series. So highly recommend this book. Like I say, it was really impactful for me in my faith personally, and tangentially, it also really helped inspire the way I'm writing characters of faith in the Guambi Tetralogy. So definitely go check it out. Now, before I move on to my 5 fiction books that inspired the Guambi Tetralogy, I'm going to cheat a little bit and actually give you 2 films that highly inspired the Guambi Tetralogy. So I know, I lied, deal with it. So starting off with a film that heavily inspired the Guambi Tetralogy is Mel Gibson's The Patriot. Now, at the time I wrote the Guambi Tetralogy, The Patriot was one of my favorite films of all times. It no longer holds quite so high a place in my filmography, but it's still a really solid film, and specifically the way black powder warfare is portrayed in The Patriot heavily inspired the way I do black powder warfare in the Guambi Tetralogy. That said, The Patriot obviously is an R-rated film, and I was trying to keep it PG-13 with the Guambi Tetralogy, but at the same time, a really critical part of the Guambi Tetralogy is I wanted to wrestle with the really grave realities of violence. Even though this is a swashbuckling adventure, I didn't want to take the violence lightly, and really wanted readers to have to sit with how awful war is. So in some ways, it's pretty appropriate that it was an R-rated film that did a lot to shape my thinking around black powder warfare. The Patriot, again, great film, and would definitely recommend watching it if you're up for some pretty intense violence. And then my second film that highly inspired the Guambi Tetralogy is Don Bluth's The Secret of NIMH. This movie, I did not realize how much it inspired the Guambi Tetralogy until much later, when I was recently rewatching this film with my kids, and I realized how much the character of Mrs. Brisby, the heroine of The Secret of NIMH, really inspired the way I write heroines in my own books. Which is these characters who are, like, you cannot say they're not strong female characters, but at the same time, they depict a strength that is unlike what you usually think of as heroic strength. Like, they're not buff, they're not good fighters, but they are indomitable. And just the bravery and the courage of Mrs. Brisby really inspires the way I'm writing the female protagonist in this book. Just like the indomitable bravery, even if they're technically not the strongest kid on the block, they are super strong characters. And also the tone of The Secret of NIMH was really impactful for me as a child. Like, I've always loved The Secret of NIMH. It's one of my favorite animated films for sure. And the tone of this very grim world with a lot of darkness, but also just bright, cozy, and hopeful. And the way it juxtaposes this cozy hopefulness with this dark, grim reality, and then how it uses that juxtaposition to ratchet up the courage of the heroine is just spectacular. And that's definitely, those tones are things I'm playing with in this series. There's elements of the Guambi Tetralogy that feel really cozy, and then other elements that almost border on horror, and that's entirely the fault of The Secret of NIMH. I'm not going to lie. The Secret of NIMH is to blame for the way I'm playing with the tones in the Guambi Tetralogy. So, moving on to my my fiction inspirations for the Guambi Tetralogy. This book here, I cannot even give you in words how impactful this book is for me, and that is Watership Down by Richard Adams. And okay, I'm gonna have to, like, okay, so look at this beautiful box it's in, and then pull this thing out here. You're gonna have to see this. Look at this. Look at the binding. Look how this is bound. This is the Platonic ideal of how a book should look. Okay, I don't think you're ready. I'm gonna Okay, this might mess with the mic, but sorry, you have to see this. You have to see how beautiful this book is. Let's find one. Oh, look at this illustration. Look at General Woundwort there. Isn't General Woundwort just so awful? Yes. Okay, now, because I cannot tell you in words how impactful Watership Down is to me, I'm going to have to give you just a story of how amazing this book is. So I first read this book as a teenager. I think it's probably about 16. And the first time I read this book, I immediately fell in love with it, which is what every sensible human being does when they read The Watership Down. And I immediately knew I needed to own a copy of this book. And at this time, I did not have a job. I didn't have any way to get money. And so for the first time in my life, I went into debt to purchase this exact edition of Watership Down. I have since paid back my mother I think it was like £29 for this book, because I had to ship it in from England, because you cannot buy this in America. And like I said, this is one of my favorite physical books that I own, is this edition of Watership Down. Anyway, I will stop gushing over how beautiful this book is. And just say, one of the main inspirations for Watership Down, the way Watership Down inspired the Gombe Tetralogy, is the way that Richard Adams writes characters. I mean, in Watership Down, all the characters are rabbits, but the way he does Hazel and Fiver and Bigwig, these characters just feel so real to life and so thoroughly 3D and fleshed out. But he does that without relying on these gimmicks or comic booky, bombastic, over-the-top ways of writing characters, which is what you get very often in fantasy. Say, Wheel of Time. All of those characters are very gimmicky. Even, say, I hate to say it, Joe Abercrombie, as much as I love the man, a lot of his characterization works because he's doing these bombastic, kind of comic book style characters. And we love that. I'm not knocking Joe Abercrombie. I love Joe Abercrombie. But Richard Adams pulls off this really spectacular way of writing characters, and that they're not bombastic. They're not over the top. They're not gimmicky, but they're so thoroughly fleshed out and real to life. And that is what I was attempting to do in the Gombe Tetralogy. I really hope I succeeded. Obviously I'm not the master that Richard Adams is, but you can read these books and tell me if I succeeded. But Watership Down was the main inspiration for how to write characters. Moving on to... Now, this book, I could probably have picked one of many R.M. Ballantyne books, but because Pirate City was the R.M. Ballantyne book that started it all for me, this is the book I'm choosing. Now, R.M. Ballantyne was one of my favorite authors in high school. I loved him. He's a bit of a strange author to come at, because he's basically writing middle grade books, but in the Victorian period. So they're unlike anything you're ever going to read. I hesitate to call it classic literature, but it kind of feels a little bit like how classic literature would feel, and that they're dated. The narrative convention is very different, but at the same time, they feel a lot more accessible because it was literally written for middle schoolers. But the vocabulary, no middle schooler could ever read this book today, because the vocabulary is just super intense. That said, I love R.M. Ballantyne. He holds a very special place in my heart. This book particularly, as a pirate novel, although he's dealing with the piracy of Algiers, which is more of an inspiration for my novel Flashes of Fire, my standalone novel that you can get for free from my Substack. So that version of piracy you see in this book is not really similar to the piracy you're going to see in the Gombe Tetralogy over there. But some of his other books that deal with the Canadian wilds and the frontiers of America were really influential on how I was writing this book, because R.M. Ballantyne spent 20 years of his life as a fur trader for the Hudson Bay Fur Trading Company in the wilds of Canada, trading with Indigenous peoples. And so the way he writes about this frontier experience and this interaction with Indigenous peoples is really cool, because it's based off of firsthand experience from Ballantyne's perspective. And it definitely comes across as a little bit dated, definitely not nearly as racist as you usually read in the Victorian period. But the way he writes these interactions between these frontiersmen and colonists and these Indigenous peoples was a heavy inspiration for the way I'm talking about the interaction between Indigenous people and colonists in the Gombe Tetralogy. So that's R.M. Ballantyne. I love him. I would totally recommend people reading these books, but they're kind of strange to get into, because like I said, it's middle grade Victorian books. They're not like anything you've read before, but it's totally worth getting into, because Ballantyne is such a fun and delightful author. Moving on to, oh, here we go. Here's a classic that more people need to be reading. The Bark of the Bog Owl by Jonathan Roger. This book is technically middle grade, but any adult is going to have a lot of fun reading this book. The whole series, the Wilder King trilogy, is basically like if King David had grown up in the Everglades swamps. And this book really impacts the way I write fantasy, both as far as just like the really American flavor to fantasy as opposed to the European flavor you usually get in fantasy, but also the way Jonathan Roger includes Christianity in the fantasy. Up until reading The Bark of the Bog Owl, all of the Christian fantasy I read did one of two things. Either it was like trying to convert the reader, which I just cannot stand that, or like the Chronicles of Narnia, they would be like trying to expound on a specific ideology or dogma and try to like tell it in a story, which sometimes can be done successfully, sometimes is not done very successfully. But neither of those visions of Christian fantasy really was inspirational to me. I didn't like either of those. So it wasn't until reading The Bark of the Bog Owl by Jonathan Rogers here that it really showed me, it really inspired how I write fantasy from a Christian perspective. And that is, I'm not trying to give you a specific dogma. I'm not trying to convince you of a specific theological perspective. I'm not trying to convert you. I think non-Christians are going to really enjoy this book series because, again, it's not about me trying to convert you. Instead, the main idea behind this book series is that all of the characters in this book are peoples of faith. And so I use their faith as an extra dimension to their character development. And that's exactly what Jonathan Rogers does in this book as well, where you have these characters, you have the plot, you have their character arc. But in addition to that, you have this other aspect to their arc, this other aspect to their character, which is their relationship with God and their relationship with religion and how that changes and evolves and grows through the events of the plot. Jonathan Roger did an amazing job with it in this book, and it was the main inspiration for how I'm writing these faith journeys in the Gwambi Tetralogy, for sure. So this book, more people need to be reading. It's a phenomenal book. The Bark of the Bog Owl, the whole Wilder King trilogy, just amazing. Moving on to, this is a true classic, A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. I don't feel like I really need to say much about this book. I should hope you're familiar with this book if you are at all familiar with any piece of literature. A Tale of Two Cities is just a phenomenal book. This is also, fun fact, the first book I ever cried while I read. The final chapter of this book, I was in tears, rolling down my face. That was the first time it ever happened to me. And it doesn't happen very often, still does not happen very often, but Tale of Two Cities still lives rent-free in my head. Again, I'm not going to say a whole lot about this book, but I will say, for those who are reading the Gwambi Tetralogy and seeing the central mystery around Ella's father in this book, keep A Tale of Two Cities in mind. All right, just keep this book in mind. I'll say no more. And finally, moving on to my final inspiration of fiction books for the Gwambi Tetralogy is, of course, Kidnapped by Robert Louis Stevenson. Again, I'm gonna have to take this dust jacket off here, guys. Okay, look at this book. Look how beautiful. See, not only is this just like that perfect cloth binding, like every book needs to be cloth bound like this, okay? That should be a rule because it's gorgeous. But look, this one also has the cover, the gorgeous painting by N.C. Wythe. N.C. Wythe was just such a great illustrator. I wish I had more books illustrated by N.C. Wythe. But look at this. Okay, well, first off, okay, you didn't know you were going to get book porn in this book, in this movie, in this video. But look, see how those pages, like, they don't line up properly? I am obsessed. I love it. I forget what this is called. Every book needs to be bound this way. It's just, this is the perfect way to bind a book when they don't line up all the way, because you feel all like aristocratic and like you're just like Gandalf the Grey going through these old books. But then look at the illustrations here. Like this ink pen drawing illustrations by N.C. Wythe. This is just gorgeous. This is peak illustrations. And frankly, this is major inspiration behind the ink pen drawings you're going to see in the Gwambi Tetralogy. The illustrations in that book are highly inspired by the illustrations from N.C. Wythe. Anyway, enough of that. Kidnapped by Robert Louis Stevenson. I could just as easily have picked up Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson as a strong inspiration behind my books. The main reason I didn't is because my copy of Treasure Island is much less beautiful than my copy of Kidnapped. Anyway, Kidnapped, though, was a major inspiration for the Guambi Tetralogy, not just like the fun, swashbuckling vibes that is definitely what you're going to get in my books, but also the written dialect for the dialogue. In Kidnapped, you have this Scots brogue dialect that Robert Louis Stevenson writes out, and I was obsessed with this when I read these books. I loved the dialect when it's all written out in the dialogue. It was just so great. I loved it. It was really cool, and that really inspired the way I wrote the dialects of the Pistosians in the Guambi Tetralogy and the pirates. That's probably one of the biggest feedbacks I hear all the time is the dialects, both positive and negative. I had to continually be rewriting how I was writing dialects to make it more and more intelligible. Early drafts, the dialect was way out of hand. But now I think you should be able to make sense of the dialect. It should be easily readable, but also have this really fun, creative flavor. It is loosely inspired by Scots, for sure, and that is Robert Louis Stevenson's fault for making me fall in love with Scots brogue dialect. But I did try to make it its own unique dialect in the Guambi Tetralogy. And hopefully you enjoy that. I love writing a good dialect, and I had so much fun inventing the dialect behind the Pistosians for the Guambi Tetralogy. But anyway, those are my 10 books that inspired the Guambi Tetralogy. Let me know if you've read any of those books or what you thought of those books. I would love to talk about that in the comments. If you guys have anything to say, I'd love to get into that with y'all. But yeah, there you are. Again, if you're interested in reading some of my writing without spending money, again, go to my Substack, subscribe for free, and you'll get that free ebook of Flashes of Fire. And that way, you can read my books. You can see if my writing is up for you. If it is, then you can start buying something, and I would really appreciate that. If you don't like my writing, that's okay. You just unsubscribe, and no harm, no foul, right? So there you are, and until next time, happy reading.